Chicago, October 14th, 1967. The most prestigious concert hall in the Midwest had just made a decision that would destroy its reputation forever. Andy Williams stood in the marble lobby of the Chicago Symphony Hall, his autumn tour in full swing, about to perform for 2,800 of the city's cultural elite. But in the next 20 minutes, the venue owner would say something so shocking that Andy would walk away from the biggest payday of his career. What Andy did next didn't just end a concert, it ended a man's empire. The Chicago Symphony Hall had been the crown jewel of American classical music since 1904. Its marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and perfect acoustics made it the dream venue for any serious artist. When Andy's manager secured the booking for October 14th, 1967, it was considered a career milestone. Andy Williams wasn't just crossing over from television to the concert stage. He was being accepted by the cultural establishment. The tickets sold out in 6 hours. Chicago's social elite, music critics from major newspapers, and Andy's television fans all wanted to witness this moment. The venue owner, Richard Whitmore, stood to make over $200,000 that night, more than any single concert in the hall's history. Whitmore was old Chicago aristocracy, a man who traced his family back to the city's founding fathers. He believed certain standards must be maintained. Andy arrived at the hall at 5:30 p.m. for the 8 p.m. show. His small orchestra traveled with him, 7 musicians who had become his musical family over the past 3 years. 3 of them happened to be black: Samuel Johnson on piano, Leonard Baker on violin, and Charles Monroe on cello. They were among the finest classical musicians in America, trained at conservatories, seasoned professionals who brought sophistication to Andy's arrangements. As they approached the artist's entrance, a security guard stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Samuel, Leonard, and Charles. "You gentlemen will need to use the service entrance. It's around the corner on LaSalle Street." Samuel Johnson looked confused. "We're Mr. Williams's orchestra. We're performing tonight." "I understand," the guard replied, not unkindly but firmly. "But house policy requires colored personnel to use the service entrance. It leads to the same backstage area. Nothing personal." The white musicians in the group, the violinist, the drummer, the backup vocalist, and the cellist, stopped walking. Andy was still in his car, finishing a phone call with NBC about his upcoming Christmas special. The orchestra stood there, unsure what to do. "We should wait for Andy," said the drummer quietly. "Policy is policy," the guard said. "The main entrance is for patrons and featured artists only. Supporting musicians of color use the service entrance. Those are Mr. Whitmore's rules." That's when Richard Whitmore himself appeared. He was a distinguished man in his early 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and the kind of confident smile that came from generations of privilege. Everything about him spoke of tradition, refinement, and absolute certainty in the way things should be done. "Good evening, gentlemen," Whitmore said warmly. "I hope there's no confusion here. We're simply following the house protocols that have served this institution well for over 60 years. He gestured toward Samuel, Leonard, and Charles. "These fine musicians can enter through our service entrance. It's actually more convenient, closer to the dressing rooms." Leonard Baker, the violinist who had studied at Juilliard and performed with symphonies across Europe, spoke quietly. "Mr. Whitmore, we prefer to enter with the rest of the orchestra. We're all part of the same ensemble." Whitmore's smile never wavered, but something shifted in his eyes. "Young man, I appreciate your perspective, but this is Chicago Symphony Hall. We have certain standards to maintain. Our patrons expect a particular atmosphere. I'm sure you understand." "What we understand," said Samuel Johnson, "is that we're professional musicians who deserve basic respect." "And you'll have it," Whitmore replied smoothly, "through the appropriate entrance. Let's not create an unnecessary situation when Mr. Williams arrives. I'm sure he'll want to focus on his performance, not logistics." The white musicians looked at each other. They had played with Samuel, Leonard, and Charles for 3 years. They had shared hotel rooms, meals, long bus rides between cities. The idea of entering separately felt fundamentally wrong. "We'll wait for Andy," the backup vocalist said firmly. Whitmore's expression tightened slightly. Gentlemen, I'm trying to be reasonable here, but I have 2,800 patrons arriving in 2 hours. Many of them are major donors to this institution. I cannot change decades of protocol for one evening. That's when Andy Williams stepped out of his car. He took one look at the group standing frozen at the entrance and immediately sensed the tension. His musicians weren't talking or joking, as they usually did. They stood in two distinct groups, and something was very wrong. "Is there a problem?" Andy asked quietly. Whitmore immediately brightened, extending his hand. "Mr. Williams, what an honor. I'm Richard Whitmore, the venue director. We're simply clarifying entrance procedures with your orchestra." Andy looked at Samuel, Leonard, and Charles, then back at Whitmore. "What kind of clarification?" "Well," Whitmore said, "our house policy requires supporting musicians of color to use the service entrance. It's nothing personal, simply how we maintain order and tradition." Andy was quiet for a long moment. He looked at Samuel Johnson, who had taught him the piano arrangements that made his television performances so distinctive. He looked at Leonard Baker, whose violin solos had brought tears to audiences across the country. He looked at Charles Monroe, whose cello work had earned praise from classical critics. "I see," Andy said finally. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "And where exactly is this service entrance?" Whitmore relaxed, misinterpreting Andy's tone. "Just around the corner. Very convenient. They'll be backstage in no time." Andy nodded thoughtfully. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to understand something. Are you saying that 3 members of my orchestra aren't good enough to walk through the same door as the other 4? "It's not about being good enough," Whitmore said quickly. "It's about propriety, protocol, the way things are done at an institution like this." "The way things are done," Andy repeated softly. "Exactly. I'm sure you understand the importance of tradition, Mr. Williams. Your own career is built on timeless values, classic American ideals." Andy looked at Whitmore for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice remained gentle, almost regretful. "Mr. Whitmore, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Whitmore smiled, confident he was winning the argument. "Not at all. Just a small adjustment to accommodate everyone." "No," Andy said quietly. "The misunderstanding is that you believe I would perform at a venue that treats my musicians as less than equal." The smile began to fade from Whitmore's face. "Now, Mr. Williams, let's be practical here. We have a sold-out show tonight. Hundreds of people are counting on this performance. Your fans, our patrons, the musicians themselves. They all want this concert to happen." "They do," Andy agreed, "but not under these conditions." Whitmore's voice took on a slight edge. "These aren't conditions. This is standard operating procedure at every major venue in the country. I'm simply maintaining the dignity of this institution." "Whose dignity?" Andy asked. The question hung in the air. Whitmore looked confused, as if the answer were obvious. "The dignity of Chicago Symphony Hall, our reputation, our standing in the community." Andy glanced at his musicians again. The black musicians stood with quiet dignity, not pleading, not angry, just disappointed. The white musicians stood beside them in solidarity. They were all looking at him, waiting to see what kind of man he really was. "Mr. Whitmore," Andy said, "I'm going to explain this once, very simply. Either all 7 members of my orchestra enter through the same door I use, or no one performs tonight." Whitmore laughed, a nervous, disbelieving sound. "Mr. Williams, surely you're not serious. We have a contract. You're contractually obligated to perform. If you walk away, the financial consequences will be severe." "I understand," Andy said. "Do you? Do you understand that this concert represents over $200,000 in revenue? That canceling now would destroy your relationship with every major venue in the Midwest? That you'd be sued for breach of contract?" Andy was quiet for a moment, considering. "Mr. Whitmore, may I ask you something?" "Of course. When you go to sleep tonight, what do you want to remember about today?" Whitmore looked genuinely puzzled. "I'm sorry? Do you want to remember the night you made a fortune hosting Andy Williams? Or do you want to remember the night you stood in your lobby and told 3 brilliant musicians they weren't worthy of basic respect?" "This isn't about respect," Whitmore said, his voice rising slightly. "This is about order, about tradition, about the way civilized society functions. Andy nodded sadly. I see. Well, Mr. Whitmore, I hope your traditions serve you well. He turned to his orchestra. Pack up the instruments. We're leaving. For a moment, no one moved. The magnitude of what was happening was sinking in. Andy Williams was walking away from the most prestigious concert of his career because a venue owner insisted on a segregated entrances. Wait, Whitmore said, panic creeping into his voice. Let's discuss this rationally. Perhaps we can find a compromise, Andy paused. What compromise? What if... Whitmore struggled. What if we allow them to enter through the main door, but discreetly? No photographers, no fuss. They slip in quietly. Mr. Whitmore, Andy said gently, my musicians don't slip in anywhere. They walk in with dignity, same as anyone else, or we don't perform. You're destroying me over this, Whitmore said, his composure finally cracking. This concert was going to establish this venue as a premier destination for popular music. The publicity alone is worth hundreds of thousands. You can't just walk away. I'm not walking away from anything, Andy replied. I'm simply refusing to participate in something that's wrong. Whitmore pulled out the contract, his hands shaking slightly. This document says you perform tonight. This is legally binding. Andy looked at the contract, then at Whitmore. Sue me if you feel you must, but I won't perform at a segregated venue. The orchestra began loading their instruments back into the vehicles. Samuel Johnson paused as he passed Andy. Thank you, he said quietly. This means more than you know. Andy put his hand on Samuel's shoulder. No one should have to thank anyone for basic human decency. As the cars pulled away, Whitmore stood in his marble lobby, watching his financial future disappear. By 7 p.m., word had spread that the concert was canceled. The phones began ringing immediately. Angry patrons demanded refunds. Society reporters wanted explanations. The story leaked quickly. Andy Williams had canceled his show because the venue enforced segregated entrances for black musicians. The backlash was swift and devastating. Chicago's younger generation, already questioning segregation policies, rallied behind Andy's decision. Older, more conservative patrons defended Whitmore, but they were increasingly outnumbered. The story made national news. Television commentators debated whether entertainers should take political stands. But the damage to Chicago's Symphony Hall was irreversible. Major artists began canceling bookings. The venue's reputation for exclusivity became a liability rather than an asset. Within 6 months, Whitmore was forced to resign. The board of directors, facing financial ruin, hired a new director with explicit instructions to welcome all performers regardless of race. Andy never spoke publicly about that night in detail. When reporters asked, he simply said, I work with the finest musicians I can find. I won't perform anywhere that doesn't treat them with the respect they deserve. But privately, the decision had cost him dearly. Several major venues in the South canceled his bookings. Conservative fans burned his albums. His television ratings dipped temporarily as some viewers turned away in protest. Samuel Johnson, Leonard Baker, and Charles Monroe stayed with Andy for the rest of their careers. In a 1975 interview, Samuel was asked about that October night in Chicago. People ask if it was worth it, Samuel said, walking away from all that money, all that prestige. I tell them it wasn't about the money. Andy Williams taught us something that night. He showed us that some things matter more than success. He gave up the biggest concert of his career because he wouldn't be part of a system that humiliated us. You don't forget something like that. Richard Whitmore never recovered financially or professionally. He died in 1973, still bitter about what he called the night political correctness destroyed tradition. But he was wrong about who destroyed what. Andy Williams didn't destroy Richard Whitmore's career. Richard Whitmore destroyed it himself by choosing prejudice over progress. The story became legendary among musicians. It inspired other artists to demand equal treatment for all their band members. Venue by venue, policy by policy, the old segregation practices began to crumble. Not because of laws or protests, but because artists refused to perform under discriminatory conditions. In 1985, Andy was asked about the biggest sacrifice he'd ever made for his principles. Chicago, 1967, he answered without hesitation. I walked away from Chicago Symphony Hall because they wanted my black musicians to use a different entrance. People thought I was crazy. They said I was throwing away my career over symbolism. But it wasn't symbolic to Samuel, Leonard, and Charles. It was their dignity. The reporter asked if he'd make the same choice again. Andy smiled. Without question, some things are worth more than money or fame. Treating people with respect is one of them.